Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. It's nice to have you here today. I hope you're curious, interested about music and what's going on in New York City these days. I'm on Broadway near 72nd on the Upper West Side. It's a very bright, sunny day. Anyway, you may be tired of hearing about my calendar. You probably have lots of calendars at home already. But it is the new year, and I did the artwork and produced this little calendar here. It has pictures of my artwork, my drawings, and pictures of musicians, and my old violin shop, which I closed, doesn't exist anymore. And what else? Here's a string quartet with green wallpaper in the background. Anyway, eventually, I won't mention my calendar, but I think it was important that I mention it in this way. And you can find the artwork in a certain location at a certain place. I also did a children's book about a spaceman that comes down to Earth to help the kids remember to wash their hands. And it's kind of a nice book. He travels around the world. He goes to Paris, and he goes to Rio de Janeiro, and he goes to Africa, and he goes to India and Korea. He looks like this. That's the spaceman. And so I did this little booklet, if you want to order a copy. And this was last year's calendar, just so you know. It was very small, but still full of my artwork. And now we have the big one. This year, we open it up, and it's really much, much bigger, and you might enjoy it. And hopefully this year will be much better than last year. Last year was a strange year, of course, because of COVID, and we're all wearing masks most of the time, depending on if we're around people or if we're outside or what's going on. But we're hoping that this new year will bring a lot more freedom and restore what was normal for us before. I want to start off by mentioning a little bit about my beginning the violin when I was a kid. When I was around 3 years old, I knew there was a little tiny violin in the closet, and I used to always try to get that violin down. This was in my house when I was living in Portland, Oregon. I was about 3 years old. My brother had studied the violin briefly, but had given it up apparently. He wasn't pursuing it. But it was his violin sitting in the closet up high. So I had to try to climb up there to get this violin down, but it was always put away out of my reach because my father would put it to my chin, and it was too big. It was way too big for me to play at age 3, so it goes back up in the closet. Well, finally one day my father put the violin under my chin, and it stayed. It stayed down, and I began to have lessons. So my father began to show me some things, and then it's not easy for a parent to teach their kid anything for a variety of reasons. So we had an outside teacher. I believe his name was Raphael Shapiro at the time. I believe that was his name. And that was in Portland, Oregon. So I began playing the violin, but I didn't realize that I was supposed to practice every day, whether I wanted to or not. And so that was something I didn't really count on. Normally when some kid sees someone playing the violin on television, they say, I want to play that, I want to play that. But they should be aware that if they want to play that, they have to practice every day. It's like learning a new language. If you want to study French or German, you have to do it every day. Otherwise, you don't make what they call progress. So I began to practice. It was pretty much a store-bought violin. It was pretty much just store-bought. It was not fancy. It was a small little yellowish-orange violin. It was not so valuable, but to me it was very important. And I began to develop a little bit of a closer relationship with my father because he was a very fine violinist and he began to give me some lessons. But like I say, it's difficult sometimes for a parent to teach their kid something that may be important and may be emotional, and so the parent knows the kid so well that if the child is being restless or lazy, the parent would usually react differently than if a professional teacher was paid to teach the child. They would act differently and perhaps more professionally. When I got older, maybe I was only 7 or 8 or 9, and I didn't want to practice. My father once struck me with the bow and it snapped. The bow broke, and I forgot whether he hit me on the fingers or on my head, but it was always, the family always talked about how he broke a bow over my head. But he looked just as shocked as I did. I don't think he certainly intended to break a bow over my fingers or my head. But the bow is very delicate here, and it can break. And so it broke, and it was kind of like, I don't know what, it was a big to-do. Well, back to my development as a violinist. When I got older, we had moved from Texas to Portland, Oregon. I became 4 years old, 5, 6, 7, studying the violin. Again, realizing I had to practice every day. When my friends would come home from school, my mother would say, Gregory can't play, he has to practice. So my friends, after a while, began not coming home with me and asking, can Greg come out and play? Because I had to practice for an hour or two, which of course seemed like an eternity. Later, I was able to sneak out a little bit and climb trees, beautiful Douglas fir trees and evergreen trees, and play some baseball and try to have a normal childhood. I do remember one time I was about 10 years old, maybe 9 years old, 10 years old, and I was playing softball at my local elementary school in Portland, which was called Ainsworth School. And I was playing center field, and it was a pretty important school game. And just in the 9th inning, our team was ahead a couple of runs, and they called me the human fly because I was very short when I was 10, 11 years old. I was quite short. And yet I could run very fast, and I was very agile, and I could dive and catch the ball. So no matter how far away the ball was hit, I would go right to it like a magnet, and I would catch it. So they called me the human fly. Anyway, I remember my team was ahead a couple of runs. It was very late in the game, like the 9th inning. And all of a sudden, my parents were seen behind the fence saying, Gregory, you have to come home now, you have to come home now. I said, why do I have to come home now? The game's almost over, I have to just play just another 3 outs. No, Isaac Stern is at the house, and you have to play for Isaac Stern. Now, Isaac Stern was a very famous violinist most of his life. He was a terrific violinist, and he was performing a concert with my father, as my father was the conductor of the Oregon Symphony. So suddenly, I had to go at that moment, and I remember I had to walk about 60 or 70 feet to get over to where my parents were and where the fence was and go out the gate. And I looked back over my shoulder as we were leaving, and guess what? The opposing team had hit the ball right out to center field. It was a very high blooping hit, and I could have caught that with my eyes closed. But my dear friend Dwight Stevenson was up in the air with his cute little bangs in his eyes. He couldn't see the ball, and the ball hit him in the head, I think, and bounced on the ground. He was okay, but as he collected himself and was looking for the ball, the runners were running around the bases, and the other team scored 3 runs, and they won the game. So I felt miserable. Of course, when you're 8 or 9 years old, that's a very big deal. And that was an example of where the universe or karma or fate or whatever it was, again, drew a tremendous line between my music and my pleasure, my childhood and my future. And that happened throughout my life quite a bit, where things were many times in conflict with choosing which part of my life I was going to cater to at that moment. Isaac Stern was a very distinguished violinist who had traveled the world, and in fact he spoke like an orator, like a diplomat. He was very interesting, and he was, at least to me as a little boy, he was very gentle and kind and very encouraging. He said, oh yes, Gregory's very talented, and yes, and I think I know where he should be studying and who he should study with, and he'd like to hear me every year and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, it was nice in that regard, but in reality, or in all honesty, I probably didn't give a hoot at the time. I was just mad that I was taken out of the game and my team lost the game, and my being a human fly and a great baseball player and all that stuff was always as a struggle. I had to practice the violin every day. But as I say, I did like climbing the trees in Oregon, being in the Pacific Northwest. Those huge Douglas fir trees and evergreen trees were like 40, 50, 60 feet high. And I would climb up to the very tip and sway around in those trees. Maybe you'll see a few of my drawings. My artwork depicts sometimes those kind of images of kids way up in the trees, or playing baseball, or something to do with my childhood. I eventually, when I was 11 years old, was my first full-size violin. Now, I was still pretty little for my age. I began to grow later, maybe 13, 14, 15, I began to shoot up. And prior to that, I'd been a little squirt. But the violin my father bought me, finally, when I was 11 years old, was made in Italy, and by Joseph and Antonius Galliano. Those were two brothers that lived at the end of the 18th century. I would say this was made probably in the year 1800, 1801, 1802, because the label had a 17 on it, and the 17 was crossed out, and somebody had written with ink 18 something, or 1800. So they had, probably the violin production shop had a made label that said 1700s, 17s, 17s, and then space, where they would write in the year. But since the century became the 1800s, which is 19th century, they just crossed out the 17 label and put 18, I think it was 00. So it was made at the turn of the century, and it was a very nice violin. I believe my father paid $4,000 for it. And many years later, when I sold it to Jacques Francais, a very famous violin dealer, years later, I think he paid something like $30,000 for it. And I also dissipated that money rather quickly myself. That's another story. But I also went to work for Jacques Francais many years later, many years later. But at the time, I retained that Galliano violin for many years. Let's say, I would imagine 20 years. So the value went up, and violins, by the way, if you buy the right one, like artwork, are a very good investment. They go up very fast. They're excellent investments, but you have to trust the dealer or the person that advises you which violin to buy. If you want to buy a viola or a cello or a bow, again, you need expert opinions, because some instruments are damaged, or they're not completely authentic, or they don't sound good. The wood has been changed over the years, maybe graduated. So there's many reasons why you have to be careful what you invest in. Later, I had some other nice violins. I changed violins a little bit for various reasons. Of course, I sold my Galliano because I needed the money. And I bought some more modern violins. If you're curious what this violin is, and I'll play you a couple of quick notes on it. Now, with the cold weather outside and the warmth inside, the strings don't stay in tune too well. That's out. By Bach. This violin was made by Benjamin Spillman. I'm looking for the year, because I knew who made it, Benjamin Spillman from California, but it was made in the year 2011. So it's a modern violin, more modern, but very nice. Well, I selected this violin out of many violins. I like the sound of it. It has a little bit of an older quality to it. The Galliano was made, as I told you, in the late 18th century, early 19th century. This violin was made in the 21st century, the year 2011, but it has an older feel to it. I like the way it rings out. I like the tone of it. So I'm content with it. if I had a choice to play this violin or some other violin, I would have to see, because there's no complete rule of thumb. It doesn't mean all old violins are better than new violins, and it doesn't mean all new violins are better than old violins. So I'd have to see, but it would take something quite valuable to sound better than this. And I think the price is quite reasonable of what he's selling these for. And I, at the moment, just won't mention what it is, but it's a reasonable price. But his name is Benjamin Spillman, and I think he's from Berkeley, California. On the other hand, there's a famous story about Jascha Heifetz, when somebody went backstage to Mr. Heifetz and said, "Oh, Mr. Heifetz, your Stradivarius sounds so great. You know, your Guarnerius or your Stradivarius or whatever you're playing on. What a great violin!" And apparently, the story goes is that Heifetz went like this. I don't hear anything, meaning that the violin does not play by itself. If you have a bad violinist, if you give him a great Stradivarius or her, it'll still sound pretty bad. And if you give a good violinist, even a mediocre violin, it should sound pretty good. They'll make a good tone out of it. I always had a talent to play all kinds of violins and try to find the spot that makes the best tone. If you take a violin unknown to you and you press too hard, it may sound a little astringent. But if you know how to adjust immediately and take a little pressure off the last note being this as opposed to that, it makes a difference. So I was very quick to adjust to the voice of each violin. There was a man in my building in New York named Michael, and whenever he had a client to show the violin to, he would call me up and say, "Gregory, come upstairs real quick, I want you to play a violin for me." And I would play it for his client. By chance, he was in the violin business. And I made a nice tone on most of the different violins because I knew exactly how hard to press. And I helped him, I guess, maybe sell some violins. But of course, I was 12 years old, 13, 14. No, actually, I was 15, 16, or 17. Because my family moved to New York City when I was about, I will say, 16 or something. I went to high school in New York City. My sophomore year, I went to a school which no longer exists. It was called Lincoln Square Academy. I also went to Performing Arts High School, the one they made a TV show about, which was a very funny coincidence because my sister and I went to Performing Arts High School, and a little bit later, my sister co-starred in the TV series called Fame, and that was about the Performing Arts High School, about the kids in New York City that played music and danced and sang and all that kind of stuff. And so it was quite a special school, and it was called the Performing Arts School. Well, in regard to the fact that a lot of young students have extremely valuable instruments under their chin or in their hands, is true. It's a fact. I mean, some parents buy very expensive violins for their kids, and violas and cellos, etc. Brass and woodwind instruments are not that expensive because they're mass-produced more so, and they're just not made out of wood. They're not 18th century instruments that are played on today. So we won't discuss the woodwind instruments and brass family. But the string family, there are some 18th century Italian instruments, and most of the really prestigious makers were Italian and inspired before, well, after Stradivarius. They couldn't be inspired before Stradivarius, but they were inspired by different masters, different makers that made terrific instruments. They had a great stringed instrument tradition in Italy. The bows, the tradition was in France. And of course, the music, a lot of the music of the time was in Germany. Bach and Beethoven and Mozart were considered German composers. But of course, they were great French composers. There weren't too many great English composers, they say, but that's another subject. But anyway, back to our subject. It's a good question. First of all, I was a violin dealer myself for a number of years. Basically, sometimes there were some kids playing the violin which were not talented. They didn't play very well. And yet their parents were very wealthy and they wanted to buy an expensive violin. Of course, most dealers would have sold them a very expensive violin, and I should have done that very likely. But I said, you don't need an expensive violin, you need a new violin teacher where the kid needs to practice better, more intelligently. And in regard to practicing a half an hour intelligently and carefully is more valuable than practicing for hours and hours badly with the bad habits. For instance, if you were to practice with your bow like this, like you're doing yourself a lot of harm. But if you practice slowly, etc., then at least your bow arm is straight between the fingerboard and the bridge. It's straight. But if it's this way and that way, and you're practicing bad habits, of course, it doesn't matter if you do 4 or 5 or 6 hours. You're doing yourself more harm. That's just a sub point I wanted to make. Now, where was I? Oh yes. So if the child is really talented and has a future, the sooner you buy a violin, in a sense, or viola or cello, the better. I had one lady calling me on the phone. She wanted an appointment to buy a full-size violin. So I made an appointment. She came in. Her daughter was in Korea. So we looked at some violins. I played them for her, and she was interested. She wanted to buy one. Then about 2 weeks later, she called again. I thought it was the same lady, but she wanted a 3/4 size violin. And then about a month later, I thought it was the same lady, called me again, and she wanted to buy a 1/4 size violin, a tiny violin. And I said, "Aren't you the same lady that bought the full-size violin? And then weren't you looking at it?" I said, how old is your daughter?" "Oh, she's not born yet." Or she was like 4 months old. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's like, talk about pressure on the poor kid. I also was superstitious. I thought, let the kid get healthy and grow for a few years before you start buying it full-size violins that it would play when the kid was maybe 20 years old, or at least 12, 14 years old. The lady explained to me, when my daughter or son, 15 years from now, wants to buy a full-size violin, they'll be so expensive I won't be able to afford to buy it. So I want to buy it now. So that was another way of thinking. Now, as the siren goes by for the busy metropolis we have outside here in New York, I wanted to make another point about the kids playing violins. Yeah, the point I wanted to make and stress is that nowadays, because of COVID, and because of the nature of the economy and the lack of concert halls and Broadway shows are closed down, people aren't teaching in person anymore, the future value of a career in music, or value in purchasing a violin as an investment per se, I'm just saying maybe one has to think twice about pushing the kid into the profession of music. It's a very difficult profession. It's not dependable in a sense. It's not like a 9-to-5 job or a contract where you're going to be paid for many years to do certain things. If, like an actor or an actress, if you're working, you're making money. If you're not working, you're broke. So to be a violinist, let's say in this case, you'd have to be very, very good, very talented, know the right people, and have a lot of employment, and maybe fame and fortune would come to you. If not, you may be in an orchestra, or teaching violin, or playing on the street corner, or who knows what. So, and I've done that before also to make some cash when I was in Europe, etc. I think music's very important, however, no matter what you do as a profession. Music opens doors for people, you get to meet people, it's a universal language. If you don't speak their particular language, you can always unite with the love of music, or perhaps they play music. And I've told certain kids that if you grow up one day and you fall in love with somebody in a foreign country, it's good to have a degree. These days you need some kind of credentials, unfortunately, but you do need credentials. And you need to play well the musical instrument, because at some point you could travel and live in their countries and teach perhaps English and violin, and could be in a school. It may be a good thing. So you never know where you may relocate in life. And so playing the violin is a very, very helpful mechanism. I can tell you that the violin has opened the door for me, for many people, to meet many nice people. And I've also traveled to Russia and to China and Korea and Japan and all over America playing music. And it really is something that's enriched my life tremendously. And now I compose music on the violin. Want to hear something? Anyway, I wrote this piece which sounds like a Chinese piece. So anyway, I wrote that. That's the opening of the piece I wrote, which has a little bit of a Chinese sound to it. It gets a little faster later. It goes. Ding dong, little cymbals and things. It's a little bit stereotypical of an older traditional Chinese sound, but it was a nice piece. I've written many kinds of pieces, including bluegrass. I don't know if you want to hear any of that, but I played some classical pieces I've written, and that kind of thing. So, but I want to thank you for your interest in music and perhaps in my background. I'm working on my artwork. Don't forget my calendar in case you want to get a calendar. And the Spaceman children book for little children to remind them to wash their hands. And to support live music wherever you can to try to regenerate a better civilization, a better community, because we need to revitalize the arts as much as possible. But thanks for listening today. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you have more questions, keep them coming. Thanks very much.